Hi, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion webinar on RFID improving pharmaceutical supply chain efficiency and patient safety. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items I would like to go over. First is the AIM North America Antitrust and Collaboration and Work Product Policy. It is a policy of AIM North America to conduct its operations in strict compliance with the antitrust laws. No AIM activity shall create even the appearance of a violation of the letter or spirit of the antitrust laws. AIM North America committee meetings or webinars like today are held for the primary purpose of advancements in our industry, which necessarily involves development of work product intended solely for the public domain. AIM North America has developed this policy for the protection of its members who engage in this important collaborative effort. Some housekeeping items is you will notice that you are muted, but we do want you to participate on this webinar. Anytime throughout the presentation, you can send us your questions by using the Q&A option at the bottom of the application screen. We'll be answering questions at the conclusion of the webinar. This webinar also is being recorded and you'll be notified when it is available. So a little bit about AIM North America. We are the premier alliance for the automated data capture technologies industry. For more than 20 years, AIM North America has championed the growth and acceptance of these technologies and applications through education, standards, community, and advocacy. AIM North America supports consensus-based standards, promotes community, advocates, and educates. AIM North America champions concerns and solutions to industries and governments to break down market barriers and constraints. AIM North America has the recognition to be taken seriously and to help you be successful in the marketplace. So let's get into the panel. I'll have Chris Brown, RFID subject matter expert from TSC Printronix, go over today's session and kick things off. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, Mike, and welcome everybody. Today's panel discussion is on RFID to improve pharmaceutical supply chain efficiency and patient safety. Note that it's sort of a two-pronged topic, supply chain efficiency in the traditional auto ID sense, but also patient safety. We would like to thank AIM for hosting the webinar. And as you can read here on the screen, I'm not going to read it through bit by bit, but the session today is focused on the use of RFID across the entire pharmaceutical supply chain to increase those traditional efficiencies, but also to improve the patient outcomes. We're going to talk about some various use cases for RFID in the pharmaceutical sector, the different RFID technologies that are in use, some challenges we're facing to further adoption, but also conversely, some possible accelerators. And then at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about future opportunities for RFID in the sector. We're going to talk about these for about the first 45 minutes, and then at the end, we will also go through a live Q&A. And as Mike said, feel free to put questions into the Q&A feature on the app as well, and we can get to those at the end. Next slide, please.
Also to add, Chris, the views expressed and presented here are of the individual speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the speaker's respective company.
Thank you. Yes, so don't sue our companies. Okay. So our panel, everybody's going to introduce themselves. We're all active members of AIM, by the way. Gwen, could you please take it away and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So my name is Gwen Volpe, and I am the Director of Medication Technology for Fresenius Kabi. I'm also a pharmacist. Fresenius Kabi is a global healthcare company that specializes in life-saving medications and technologies for infusion, transfusion, and clinical nutrition. Our products are used worldwide to help care for critically and chronically ill patients. Thanks so much for having me today.
Tony?
Hello there, I'm Tony Funk. I'm President and CEO of Spotsy and also a board member for Engel. In fact, a little bit about Spotsy. Our mission is to help our customers spot and see changing conditions in their supply chains. And so the way to think about that is that we go on everything from vaccines up to spaceships, monitoring temperature on vaccines and pharmaceuticals, diagnostics, etc. All the way up to impact, tilt, vibration monitoring for other industrial type assets that are shipping shipping around the globe. So really happy to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity to discuss this important topic with everyone.
Thank you. Okay, Jay.
Thanks, Chris. I'm Jay Williams. I'm Vice President of Business Development for IntelliGuard. IntelliGuard is a developer, manufacturer, marketer of RFID solutions that are utilized in the acute care, non-acute care, even life science market to monitor our RFID item level inventory at those sites.
Okay, thank you. All right, next slide, please, Mike. Okay, so we're going to open up the panel discussion here with some talk about where we are in terms of adoption of RFID in the pharmaceutical sector. On the screen there, you can see the classic adoption curve, time on the x-axis and number of adopters on the y-axis. As you move further along the curve, the area under the curve is the total number of adopters. If I look at this curve and I think of RFID in the pharmaceutical sector, I think we're somewhere in the early adopters stage. We are getting adoption percentage-wise. A fair number of hospitals, for example, are using RFID, but they're only using it, we'll call it sporadically. So they're not using it for a high percentage of the total number of possible use cases for RFID. So I see the adoption as sporadic and still in the early adopter stage. Gwen, would you like to take over, please?
Sure. So thanks, Chris. So I think we all know that RFID is being used in hospitals across the country today for asset tracking and patient tracking and vaccines. When it comes to medications, we're currently in the early adopter phase. You know, RFID has the potential to improve efficiency, accuracy, and patient safety. So what's going on here, and why isn't it being used more on medications for diversion control, medication identification, or authentication? So it needs basically it needs to be incorporated into the systems that clinicians are currently using. So to ground everyone, in the US, hospitals primarily use ADCs for drug distribution, essentially secure vending machines for drugs. They're all over the hospital, from patient units to procedural areas, but they're not RFID enabled. And so these systems are in use in over 95% of US hospitals. So in contrast, a much smaller portion of US hospitals have traded in their manual kit and tray process for RFID enabled systems in specified areas of the hospital, typically in procedural areas like the operating room or in crash carts that are used in resuscitation activities. And these RFID-enabled kit and tray solutions are in roughly about 12% of US hospitals across 4 vendors. So that's approximately 750 hospitals out of 6,100. The good news is we're now at the tail end of the early adopters and ready to cross that chasm into the early majority. Something I wanted to add is the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, which is the collective voice of pharmacists in hospitals and other healthcare settings, has really taken note of the rise in RFID from these early adopters. And they've studied it and produced a new report which explores the current and future use of RFID technology in medication use systems. And we're going to be mentioning pertinent parts of that report during our discussion today. Thanks, Chris.
Yep. Okay. Jay, I believe you want to add something there too?
Sure, Chris. In addition to the use case and the adoption that Gwen mentioned for tray replenishment process and medication management on that, and actually it's an ideal use case for RFID. These are critical workflows. They are time consuming. They are fraught with error in every hospital. In addition to that use case, or the 800 hospitals that are using tray replenishment processes, we also see another 500 to 600 hospitals that are using RFID through their specialty pharma distributor. It's another ideal use case for RFID. These are high value, critical drugs. They're temperature sensitive. They could be things like coagulation factors, hyperimmune globulins, immune globulins, oncolytics, critical emergency drugs such as Crofab for anti-snake venom. As I said, it's another ideal use case for RFID because these are expensive drugs and they're emergency drugs, or in cases, you don't have a predictable patient load coming in. These are emergency products. Somebody shows up and, you with a rattlesnake bite and you need to have Crofab available. So they need to be monitored. They need to be monitored for inventory levels, for expiration, because these can be slow moving drugs. And a typical hospital can have anywhere from $250,000 to easily $1 million worth of these drugs sitting in cabinets just waiting for a patient to show up to be used. So RFID for specialty pharma distributors, these tend to be high touch type of distributors, different than typically the big three. And RFID offers like a high tech component to their high touch environment. So they are in a position to put RFID enabled smart cabinets at customer sites and then they are responsible for managing the inventory. They are responsible for having those drugs always available. They're responsible for managing the expiration. If a drug happens to be recalled, they're responsible for managing that. And the hospital literally is just concerned with every time they go to that cabinet for an emergency patient, that drug is there. And then it becomes part of what we call a vendor managed inventory program. Vendor managed inventory could be consignment, it could be auto replenishment, auto reorder, but an item comes out, RFID cabinet automatically re-inventories the cabinet, and then there's a order given to the distributor to refill that cabinet at a certain interval. So we see about another 500 to 600 hospitals are utilizing that. So, in that 10 to 15% adoption range. When we look at also being a manufacturer of the tray replenishment process, along with our smart cabinets, we don't see a lot of overlap between the two, maybe as much as 15 to 20% of our customers are using both type of solutions. So again, in both those cases, RFID is improving efficiencies, faster technology versus employee workflow, and patient safety. So drugs are always available when you need it. There's no missing, expired, or recalled drugs. So that's about it for me.
Both Gwen and Jay, if I'm doing my math correctly, so you're both talking around 500 to 800 hospitals that are using RFID, and that's about 10 to 15% of the total number of potential hospitals and clinics. Is that correct?
Yes, on medication.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so the total number is about 7,000 hospitals or clinics. Okay. Okay, thank you very much. All right, next slide, please. Now here we've taken the classic adoption curve and we've overlaid some of the different automatic identification technologies, or in the case of manual record keeping, not very automatic. Tony, could you talk a little bit about the adoption curve in terms of the different technologies shown here?
Yeah, and there's clearly, as with any adoption of innovation curve, there's a lot of change that's happening here, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, obviously, if you look over to the far right, you can see that the laggards in the industry are still using a manual record keeping process. It was interesting. I actually was speaking with president of a university hospital system just this morning about Drug and the Supply Chain Security Act and the requirements that are coming down for all the way down to the hospitals and dispensing stations for prescriptions, and where the biggest burden is actually going to fall on these institutions or these specific sites. And their biggest concern is, that 16% number just about plays out in terms of what they're seeing from a manual record keeping standpoint, but really concerned about the scramble that's taking place to make sure that everybody in the supply chain is compliant. And the reason that I bring that up is that's what's driving and going to drive a big evolution that we see here and accelerate some things that we're seeing here in terms of what technologies are used throughout the supply chain, from manufacturer to wholesale distributor, 3PL, and ultimate dispensaries, and where we have a market as well that is direct to consumer in many ways. It was 22% of the market was actually direct to consumer on pharmaceuticals before COVID-19. There's reports that it's grown as much as 10x since COVID. So people just getting used to that system, to that process, and seeing, wow, now we have a big change. So what does that mean? Well, I would say that the late majority is covered today by what we would call the 1D or one-dimensional barcode. Your traditional barcode provides serialization, but light on security. Seeing a big evolution into QR or 2D barcode provides a lot more information for us as well, obviously, but provides just another extra layer of security. And is readable by anybody's phone, for that matter, all the way through the supply chain. So very easily readable, less emphasis on infrastructure. When we get into the world of RFID, this is where a few of the hurdles are coming into play, but the efficiencies of RFID clearly outnumber some of the hurdles that we're talking about. Everyone here is most likely, if you're not familiar, if you're not familiar by name, you are familiar by practice of what NFC is. So every single mobile phone that is sold today now has actually NFC capability. So that's what you're using for automatic payment using your phone. That's what you use when you have a proximity card that you're able to use to get into a building, as an example. This is what NFC is using. It's near field communication, right? So very close near field, but ubiquitous in terms of readability, right? So again, with the phones that are out there, very easy for anybody to read the information and find out anything that's happening about a particular pharmaceutical in its journey utilizing NFC. The problem is that proximity requires it to be, it makes it very, very inefficient when you're trying to do inventory management and control at a bulk level. So if we're talking about, and I'm walking back through the value chain, but if you're talking about a wholesale distributor, one of the big three, as an example, right, where the top three represent 85% of the drugs distributed or pharmaceuticals distributed in the U.S. Easier, faster way of reading that information is automated through what's called RAIN or UHF RFID, right? So you can have a big pallet full of a specific pharmaceutical or multiple different pharmaceuticals. It passes through the wands at a dock door, and immediately all of those can be read, understood what's happening, what the unique identification is, authenticity. Is it counterfeit? What's the temperature of it? Even is an evolution that's going. The problem is at the end of the line, a consumer can't read a UHF RFID, an RFID UHF, or even a hospital administrator in many cases can't read without an appropriate reader, and so infrastructure becomes an issue. There's some combination products that are out on the market, and that's in the innovators column there, which combine. It's a dual frequency chip, so combine both an NFC, so the end of the line of this value chain can read it, and combines a UHF, so where bulk is broken, or before bulk is broken, that can be read very well, read quickly as well. So you can kind of start to see how this evolution is taking place. There's one other innovation that's not listed here, but likely and supposedly around the corner, which is, again, the same phone that we all have soon will be able to read UHF as well as NFC. All the hardware exists there today. It's just a matter of the business case making sense to write the firmware to make these phones read that information. So an interesting slope to our curve, I would say, Chris, in terms of what's happening. And I think what we need to understand more than anything is the change that's coming as a result of the Drug and Supply Chain Security Act. So, obviously by next year, we have these hospitals, we've got these dispensaries, we've got even 3PLs involved that all need to provide information within a very short time period, interoperably throughout the entire supply chain. And in order for that to occur, there need to be tools that are adopted that are far more efficient, far more accurate, and far more secure. And that's where RFID really starts to come into play, and where we would and should expect to see beginning to cross that chasm and moving beyond the early adopters and well into the early majority.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Jay?
Chris, let me, not a lot to add to what Tony's discussed, but I will say this: as a manufacturer of the products, I'll address it from what we see in the acute care and the non-acute care space, and even some of the life science space. The technologies that we're seeing. Certainly, we talked about in the first part of the webinar, we talked about medication management and the couple use cases that we talked about: trade replenishment, specialty pharma. Everything that we're seeing there is UHF, is RAIN UHF. That's the technology that we are utilizing. We're seeing the adoption beginning from pharma. Obviously, we have Gwen from Fresenius Kabi, and their decision was to move forward with the UHF technology. The other, there are some other technologies that that have either been out there for a while. HF was really early into hospitals with some of their solutions for smart shelves, tracking, some critical med surge products. Some of those cabinets still exist, but some of those use cases of tracking med surge products have even moved over to UHF technology. There are some retail applications for HF / near field that have to do with bin dispensing. And on the NFC side, in our space, in the acute care, non-acute care space, haven't seen a lot of NFC as of yet. Definitely see it at this time more as a consumer retail item, but I see a lot of opportunity for it down the road in our settings. Whether that's patient engagement, as Tony mentioned, using a phone. Phone could be for patient engagement, patient adherence of a drug, event notification. You could have a drug that comes out of one of our smart cabinets from one of our specialty distributors that it's a blood factor for a hemophilia patient at home, and they can have an app on their phone that becomes an event notification of potentially a bleed, that becomes something that goes back to a provider, that can be also notification back to a distributor to make sure additional product is coming. So I see those use cases coming. I see in the acute care setting administration of the drug potentially coming up for NFC, and potentially geolocation of an event with NFC. But today, the vast majority of what we see in our settings, acute and non-acute care and life sciences, is all based on RAIN UHF.
Okay, all right, thank you, Jay and Tony. Okay, so we're somewhere on this adoption curve, probably in the early adopters phase, but the key point is we have not been able yet to cross that proverbial chasm over into mass adoption. So now we want to talk a little bit about the hurdles that we're facing that are slowing us down from crossing that chasm, and conversely, some of the possible accelerators that'll get us over that chasm. One area that I focus on is standards, encoding standards specifically, meaning what should I encode to the tag? If you're not aware, for pharmaceutical, the encoding standards are muddled right now. There are different standards in use, and I would say, personal opinion, that none of the existing standards is ideal in terms of business use or in terms of RFID technology. A little heads up here, GS1 I generally support GS1 for encoding standards for pharmaceutical products. They are working on what they call the tag data standard. That is a big, long document that tells you what you should encode to your tags for which applications. They are working on a big update to that. They're calling it the EPC modernization. And part of their modernization work is to look specifically at the pharmaceutical industry and the labeling or the tagging of pharmaceutical products. And so probably sometime this year, GS1 will release an updated tag data standard that should have some very good new encoding schemes. That's what they call them. Standards for what you encode to your tag. They should have some new encoding schemes specifically targeted at pharma. So the obstacle is that we do not yet have clarity on good encoding standards, but we're about to cross that. The accelerator would be when GS1 publishes their new tag data standards. Jay?
Thanks, Chris. I'll address the hurdles from what we see, again, in the acute care setting. A big hurdle that has really become an issue over the course of the last couple of years through COVID and is continuing is labor shortage in the hospital, labor shortage specifically in the pharmacy. And that specifically has to do with, for the use cases that we've talked about, specifically the tray replenishment process. The use cases that exist out there require the hospital pharmacy staff to place a tag and do the association process in the pharmacy. So having labor available to do that has been a barrier, but we see, and Gwen can talk about, on the accelerator side, having source tagging, source labeling and source tagging is going to make a huge difference on that. We also see a hurdle with lack of cost data in the hospital, lack of information that we can provide as comparative in an ROI to what they're doing right now. Acknowledgement of any issues such as inventory management or diversion. And I'll also say this because it goes directly to Chris, your point about standards. Right now, and you use the word clarity, there is confusion in facilities that is related to standards, but it tends to be more vendor specific. Hospitals thinking one vendor that provides a solution is headed in one direction, and another vendor is headed in another direction with we won't call them standards, we'll just say the way the product ends up being encoded or associated, and hospitals thinking that there's a right or wrong decision. So it causes some paralysis on decision making to adopt RFID. And we really believe that RFID needs to be as easy as barcode to use. It needs to be as global and as acceptable as barcode. You pick up a barcode reader, you can read any product that comes in. And we see that's where RFID needs to get. The vendors need to accept that. That will drive adoption with pharma, and it will certainly drive adoption with hospitals. So I agree with what you said as far as standards, but there are some other hurdles that we see. And certainly a lot of accelerators that I think Gwen's going to address.
Okay, yeah, good point. I should add there, great point about the barcodes. So on the question of what do you encode to your tags, every time you go to the supermarket and buy a bag of potato chips, that supermarket can read the bag of potato chips, so can the one across town, so can the one across the country. And that's because those barcodes are encoded according to standards that everybody is aligned with. Exactly. So where we want to get to with RFID encodings for pharmaceutical is that same interoperability from the manufacturer all the way through to the end user. Sorry, I just wanted to add that. Gwen?
Point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so to add to what Jay said about hurdles, the ASHP report I mentioned earlier, they outline several factors necessary for RFID technology to gain traction in health systems. So I'm quoting them here. Number one, the development of a cost-effective industry standard for RFID tags. Number two, the expanded availability of products pre-tagged by pharmaceutical manufacturers. Number three, interoperability with automated dispensing machines, which I discussed earlier, and other technologies. And four, demonstrated outcomes. So when I think of things that will accelerate the use of RFID, we need to show the value of RFID beyond inventory management. We need to show how RFID can positively impact patient safety and diversion control. RFID can identify the right drug for the right patient at the right temperature, that something's not expired or recalled or has been tampered with or taken without authorization, even ensure it's a genuine product. It's an auto identification technology that can be read from a distance or identify a drug with a tap. And that is a lot of value. So more pharmaceutical companies really need to provide source tagging using the same encoding standards so that any RFID product can be read by anyone using any system, like the GS1 standards barcodes we use today, and no one is left out. And one of my favorite accelerators is that standardization will allow more hospital automation vendors innovating around RFID, just like they did with barcodes, and to provide the interoperability that hospital customers demand. Thanks, Chris.
Tony?
Yeah, I mean, accelerators, obviously regulation is an accelerator. There's something like 40 plus different, governments around the world that have some form of track and trace regulation in place, that drives everything on this slide in one way, shape, or form, but then clearly complemented by standards. We start to see that change. There's the technological elements as well, or the innovative elements as well that I'd mentioned earlier. A dual chip RFID, both NFC and UHF, or NFC and RAIN UHF. Obviously is something that can be applied, as Jay was saying, applied at the manufacturer level, and can, via standards, right, can live all the way through the supply chain and communicate that information as it's registered, all the way down ultimately to the point of dispense or consumption. And so those are important. The other is getting these phones the ability to read the UHF and making the appropriate modifications there really starts to open the world wide open, right? So that then you actually don't need an NFC chip at all. You can read UHF from manufacturer to distributor, 3PL, a hospital system, all the way down, a hospital or dispensary, all the way down to the consumer receiving their pharmaceutical at their doorstep, which that opens up a whole world of many other things, and what you start to see and understand how the innovations that can occur off of that. I think you'll start to see some pretty widespread adoption. I mean, it'll be pretty obvious once these regulations start going into place, such as DSCSA, and all the inefficiency, frankly, associated with record keeping that's going where it's going to start. We'll need that dough, and ultimately things will smooth out, and I think RFID will play a big role in that.
Okay, thanks. Gwen, did you want to add something here?
Really about standards. I think about every pharma company follows the GS1 standards now for barcodes to ensure accurate identification and consistency in the supply chain. And pharmaceutical companies are very highly regulated. Hospitals are scanning GS1 barcodes millions of times a day, and wouldn't that be great for RFID? When we developed our Plus RFID portfolio, we did a lot of market research. And the majority of automation vendors and hospitals we spoke with advised us to use GS1 standards, so RFID is standardized like a barcode. And formal adoption of those standards would ensure that every pharmaceutical company is consistent, and every hospital automation vendor and hospital has the ability to read and identify medication the same way. So every pharmacy can be confident that the RFID products that they purchase can be read in the systems that they already have. GS1 recognizes this and has a new RFID healthcare work group to assist in this effort. So if anyone here has not joined, I encourage you to do so, because it's going to take all of us to move RFID forward. It's such an exciting time for RFID in healthcare. And we're inching closer and closer to wider adoption. I can't wait to see what happens next, but we really have to do this together. Thanks, Chris.
Gwen, the new GS1 healthcare work group that's trying to further the adoption. If somebody has a question about that or is interested in joining, they can contact you to get connected, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we've broached the topic of regulations and regulatory bodies. Tony, you're sort of our resident expert on this. So could you go into a little more detail on where DSCSA fits into this, the FDA, and even other international regulatory agencies?
Yeah, so I mean, just to kind of step back and paint a global picture, and then I'll drill it down into a US picture, because that's the biggest change that's coming soon. Across the world, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier, there's more than 40 different countries that have launched some form of track and trace regulation. And the way to think about that is that covers approximately 75% of all prescription drugs by some form of track and trace legislation. Now, we know that the manufacturers of these pharmaceuticals are consistent at the base. So, as an example, there's 15 vaccine manufacturers, 5 of which make the lion's share of the vaccines in the world, as an example, right? So there's a lot of concentration that are going out and trying to modify or morph or adhere to all of these different regulations, which I think comes back to the points, the well-heard points about why global standards are really, really important here. When we drive that down into the Drug and the Supply Chain Security Act, which is obviously part of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration Cosmetics Act, the whole goal of it is to prevent counterfeiting, expiration, authentication, or improve authentication, prevent counterfeiting, identify expiration dates, identify exposure to conditions outside of the drug specifications, such as temperature, but even impact or damage is included in that. It's intended to expedite recalls, and all this is being done. You say, wow, there's so many different pieces to that value chain. Obviously very concentrated at the manufacturer level, but and also very concentrated in the wholesale distributor level, right, where 3 players represent 85%. When we get into the dispensary level, you've got the top 5 or 6 different distributor, or I should say pharmacies out there that represent 60% of the total, right? And that's out of 60,000 total pharmaceutical dispensaries, right? So including hospitals, including specialty pharmacies, et cetera. So you can see where things get real fragmented, and they get real fragmented real fast, and how sharing that information is going to be very, very important. So as a law in 2023, regardless of the role that you're playing in that supply chain, you've got to provide your level of your information about that specific pharmaceutical into what's called an interoperable database, right? And so what that means is picture this database highway that goes across all those different supply chains. And as you get information, as you receive or play your role in that supply chain, you need to provide that information. Should something occur, you actually need to be able to respond within less than 24 hours with the information about that specific pharmaceutical. It's even down to whether or not it has been exposed to a temperature, be able to describe the expiration date, unique identification, et cetera. So you can already think about, wow, once that highway of data and information gets built, that's the core, that's the start. But once that gets built, it's going to enable a lot of other, interoperable types of communication and information that we're going to be able to see across the entire supply chain. It'll do a lot of great things for us, right? Obviously, back to the benefits, reducing the counterfeiting, identification of when expiration is going. So first in, first out inventory management, reducing the waste that occurs. I mean, the waste rates in pharmaceutical space are in the 20 to 30% range for a number of different reasons. So all this regulation is designed to help solve that problem. And frankly, as industry, we've got the tools. We've got the efficient tools, such as RFID, to solve these problems.
Okay, thanks. Gwen, I think you wanted to add something here.
No, I think actually he covered it. I can
Okay.
cover a little bit of kind of the future patient safety aspects when you're ready.
Okay. Tony, there was a question that came in on the Q&A, and I think it's relevant here, so we can take a little sidestep. For DSCSA, Drug Supply Chain Security Act, for those who don't know, I believe they do specify QR code, but do they also specify data matrix?
It's a great question. So actually, there's no specification about what technology you're supposed to use, and that I think that's a big misnomer. I don't know where that rumor got out there, but if you read the letter of the law, it actually opens up the world to different methods that you can use. Even manual record keeping, if you really wanted to do that, you just need to be able to put it into an electronic format. But the reality is I think the way that, and in some ways, the beauty of the way that it's been designed is that it opens up the door for innovation. It opens up the door for evolving technologies. This was drafted with the whole concept in mind that we are moving to an IoT society, an Internet of Things society, and we're going to need to allow for some of the newer technologies that are coming out. I would argue RFID, depending on the market segment that you're in, is mature, but not necessarily in pharmaceutical. And so I think that RFID, that's why we believe RFID has a leg up in this race, and because it's the most cost-effective electronic radio that can gather and hold data points, throughout an entire supply chain in a secure way.
Okay, so I was mistaken. I thought QR code was specified in their 2D barcode section, but you're saying it could be QR code, could be data matrix.
Correct.
Okay, or something else. Okay, Jay, you want to add something?
If you don't mind, real quick, Chris, I think it also should be noted, I'm sorry to cut you off there, Jay, but to that point, there's DoseID has done a pilot specifically for DSCSA, where over 120 million tag units are out in the field, and with the whole purpose, doing a pilot with the FDA associated with the DSCSA compliance. So sorry, Jay, but
that's okay. No, as a matter of fact, Tony, I just want to add in the point about the importance of regulation. I happen to be involved in a product or a company that manufactured a safety syringe back in the late 90s. And, for many years, safety devices were readily available. The adoption was abysmal. It was less than 20%. California passed safety legislation requiring the use of safety over needles and any needle devices. And within a couple of years, it was at the federal level. And I venture to guess you couldn't walk into a hospital today without finding safety on every single device, which goes to the point that Gwen was making, and that's where you start to get innovation. So, there's a great corollary for where we are right now with safety devices, and that being driven by regulation. I do want to add in a couple things as far as what we see as far as agencies. We talked about GS1, the importance of GS1. Gwen talked about ASHP and their research that they've done, and how critical that is moving forward for the adoption of RFID. We briefly talked about the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, ISMP. They recently did a webinar, and Dr. Michael Cohen, who is kind of considered the guru of medication safety, medication management said, get ready for RFID, getting ready for the future. I'm paraphrasing, but you need to start looking to RFID for inventory purposes because it's available right now, and he sees, what's coming at the item level, probably more on the administration side. But those are really important. Other agencies that we look to. RAIN and AIM are critical in the promotion of technologies. And the other thing that we see going on, and I think is so important, is universities where basic research is done and having labs such as the auto ID lab at MIT, University of Wisconsin, that's looking at blood supply chain. You've got labs, RFID labs at University of Tennessee, University of Memphis that FedEx has been involved with. And then a real key piece is what's going on, because we can talk about RFID and supply chain, but if the tags and the labels can't be read along the way, and when they get to end use cases like ours, we need to make sure that what pharma is doing at one end of the supply chain can be read at the other end. And standards are a part of that, but the performance of the label, the performance of the inlay is critical. And so you have facilities like Michigan State University with the Axia Institute and the lab that they built at Michigan State. You've got ARC at Auburn. Developing performance standards. The performance standards are critical, and the ability to build a product or build a label to go on a specific medication. Again, in our use case, we're in this webinar, we're talking about pharmaceuticals. It's important that what happens at one end of the supply chain can be read at the other end. Standards are part of it, but making sure that the inlay performs. And the Axia Institute, the lab at Michigan State, is, as far as I know, the only one that's really focused on the pharmaceutical supply chain and making sure that medications, not all medications are the same. They don't all perform the same. You can't put one label on a product and expect it to work on Diprivan, say one of the products that Fresenius Kabi has come out with, and for it to perform the exact same way on another drug. There are unique qualities to the drug and to the packaging of the product that we need to recognize. So that's important. So
okay, so we need to have not only unification on the encoding standards, but also some kind of clear procedure for testing the tagged items.
Yeah. And basically standard performance standards.
Right, performance standards for the tagged items. Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, crystal ball time. We got about 10 more minutes total, so let's try to stick this next section to 5 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A. Crystal ball time, looking at opportunities for RFID in the pharma sector going forward. Gwen, you've been following the topic of medication errors and the legal implications and complications of these errors. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. The cost of medication errors is really high. And it's important that we arm our caregivers with technology that decreases that chance of error. I think of that nurse at Vanderbilt, Redonda Vaught, and she was convicted of negligent homicide and impaired adult abuse and the death of a patient. She mistakenly gave the paralyzing agent vecuronium instead of the anti-anxiety sedative Versed, which killed patient Charlene Murphy. In addition to human error, there were systems error in play in that case. And I think of, how can we improve the medication use process to support our caregivers? RFID is a technology to take note of. Doctors, pharmacists, nurses take care of patients at their most vulnerable moments. All of you have been or will be a patient at some point. These caregivers are busy and plagued with interruptions. How can we clear out the noise so they can concentrate? So there is such an opportunity to utilize RFID into systems and workflows, not only to improve efficiency, but patient safety as well. And I think it's going to take all of us working together to do that. And I think we can. So that's what I think about, Chris.
Okay, so a great opportunity for reduction of medication errors and improved patient safety.
Yes.
Okay, Tony, what do you see in the future?
Yeah, I mean, attaching or just the capacity, the data capacity and the information capacity of an RFID chip as an example, the innovation that comes off of that, the ability to monitor things like temperature, right? I mean, if you think about the space, 3.5 billion vaccines and over 500 different temperature sensitive drugs are distributed annually. So, that's a big problem. Even bigger problem when you look at the fact that wasted rates are in the 20 to 30% range, specifically due to temperature. So, that can make the medicines ineffective or harmful or just turn them into waste. Think about what we just went through over the course of the last 2 years. And I can't imagine that we fell below those wastage rates, given the temperature sensitivity of our vaccines. How do we know that we received an effective vaccine? How do we know it wasn't compromised and therefore, leaves us exposed? We don't, right? Because we didn't have that information and don't have that information. This is what this leads to. It leads to, supply chain sharing of information, but all the way down to the point that matters, which is the consumer being able to say, hey, was my drug handled correctly? Is this the right drug? Was it handled correctly? And is it effective for me to use or else, right? The consequences are absolutely horrible. It's why we have regulation in this space. But, thank goodness, we're starting to see the regulation come into play that will leverage these technologies, gives room to leverage these technologies and build on them with companies like the 4 different companies that are here, that are represented here on this panel.
Jay?
Chris, I go back to the ASHP, the 4 points that Gwen mentioned in their research, and one of them being that in order to see additional adoption, you need to see there needs to be more RFID products provided by the current medication management companies, and those are really easy to identify. It's Omnicell and Becton Dickinson Pyxis, and I think as pharma puts out product, it's a cart horse scenario, but I think as end users demand RFID to solve critical use cases, whether that's trade replenishment or anything to do with critical drugs, critical workflows, readily identified issues in hospitals. I think that you'll have the adoption from pharma, and there needs to be movement from the current medication management vendors from their legacy barcode solutions, because they're in 100% of hospitals out there. So I think we'll start to see adoption there. I think we'll start to see, again, to one of Gwen's points, as we have adoption, we'll see more innovation. So right now we tend to focus on high value products, critical drugs, critical workflows, but I think we'll start to see innovation on the side of standardizing trays in centralized pharmacies as health systems start to build centralized distribution models for their facilities. So that can drive down costs. I think we'll see more of that. I think we'll see innovation that will make RFID more readily available for shelf stock. Just, items that are up on the shelf that, you maybe aren't doing it at the item level, but you're reading a box, a case at a time. I think we'll see more of that. And we've talked about the use cases that can come down the road with dual frequency, UHF, NFC. So I absolutely agree with all of that, that we'll see products, that are being addressed, or innovations that are being addressed for patients at home. The ability to use apps on their phone. I think we'll see all of that. So.
Okay, thank you. I'll put in my 2 bits here on opportunities for the future. Source tagging. So if the products are tagged at the site of manufacturing, so far we've been talking about the use cases further down the line, mostly at the hospital, but I see the opportunity that if items are source tagged, we can leverage those RFID tags for, in simplistic terms, all of the logistics processes from the manufacturer down to the end user. Okay, it's time for Q&A. We got about 5 minutes. Dennis, I see you had a question in the chat, which Gwen answered. For the use cases you are describing, has the RFID tag been attached to the drug by the pharma manufacturer, the distributor, or the healthcare provider? And Gwen answered yes. Gwen, I presume you mean yes, yes, and yes to all of them.
Correct.
And Dennis, you're kind of opening the can of worms there, and that is we have this confusion. The utopian end game here would be to have everything source tagged and we'd be done with it. But until we get to that utopian future, the tagging is happening at all levels. Sanjay asked, is digital watermarking a technology that can be utilized in this process? Tony, I think you could answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, digital watermarking, I'm trying to think about how the application could be used in terms of serialization, et cetera. I mean, it's a good tool for, for identifying counterfeit, that sort of a thing. So the answer is yes, it probably could. You could solve it more efficiently, I would think,
okay.
interoperably in a different way.
It might assist with the counterfeiting and product authentication, but would it be able to assist with
Identification?
Identification, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay, I don't think so either. Okay. Question from an anonymous attendee. Will the new GS1 standards that Chris mentioned for pharma fit into a 128-bit RFID tag? If not, tag cost and availability will be a huge barrier to mass adoption. I'm going to rework that question a bit. The first part of the answer is yes and no. So the basic new standards can be put into a 128-bit tag. You can leverage those new standards, and I don't speak for GS1, and these standards are not finalized. So this is the current state of things, subject to change. You can do things like add additional application identifiers, which would take you above 128 bits. You could use a full alphanumeric serialization scheme that would take you 128 bits. But I believe your big question is, if we go above 128 bits, are we going to hit this barrier to mass adoption? I've looked into chip costs, and the amount of memory on the chip is minor. So the cost of the chips and the consequent cost of the tags is really not a function of the amount of chip memory. It's a function of who's producing how many of those chips in a mass supply situation. So if the new standards really make sense with let's say 196 bits, look to the chip companies to respond by producing new commodity 196-bit chip tags. And if that happens, then the cost of the tag is going to go up by, I don't know, 1/4 of a penny. So it'll be very small. Let's see here. Mike Stone, I have to scroll down. Mike Stone, will pharma see the value in a 25 to 50 cent tag that supports sensors? Too often pricing for non-sensor tags are compared to high capability tags. In my opinion, if you had a 25 to 50 cent sensor tag, that would be a home run. That would be very, very affordable.
I agree with you, Chris. I mean, the more that you can, well, they're using indicators or sensors in some way, shape, or form today, right? Or data loggers, et cetera. So the more that we can consolidate all of that into one device that's then used throughout the entire supply chain, that's the utopian situation that we're talking about here. And good news is most of the technology exists.
Okay, we have a few more questions, but I'm afraid we're out of time. We'll try to answer those questions by email. Mike, I guess I pass it back to you. And by the way, here you can see our contact information, so feel free to email any of us. Mike?
Yeah, just like Chris said, feel free to send an email and chat with them. Have that on the screen now. I also have AIM North America's contact on the screen. Again, thanks everyone for their time and participation today. I will let everyone know when the recording of today's webinar session is available. So thanks everyone and enjoy the rest of your day.